Autism Canada depends on the generous support of viewers like you. If you find this presentation helpful, consider donating at autismcanada.org.
Our next presenter is Dave Humphrey, and I have to tell a couple little stories. A number of years ago, I was trying to decide on what lecture I'd like to go to, and a gentleman by the name of Dave Humphrey was presenting with Martha Herbert, who I knew very well. And I was so taken back by his presentation about we're in it for the world. We need to work together. I found my way up to him, and people were around him, and I finally got to him, and I shook his hand, and I said, "I'm Laurie Mollum. I'm going to be here till Sunday. You think we can have a coffee?" And he invited me down to a meeting that was taking place that he was chairing about the Autism Research Institute and the Autism Society of America and the Easter Seals all working together. I drove back after that meeting. It was a 7-hour drive back to where I live and where I work. And I thought about, we need to work together in Canada. And it was because of Dave Humphrey that the Canadian ASD Alliance was formed. And I had a chance to share that story with him this year because I never did speak to him again. So I got him on the phone this year and I said, "Dave, I'd really like to do a lecture about where we've been, because everyone thinks autism has been around forever, the rates have been the same. People are forgetting, or maybe don't know who Bernie Rimland is anymore, because families are just getting into this. But Bernie Rimland was around when my son was diagnosed, and he was a pretty big player." So I shared with him that I'd like to talk about where we're going, too. And he goes, "Well, Laurie, I don't know if you know this, but I was Bernie Rimland's personal lawyer for 25 years plus." Oh, I didn't know that. I knew Dave Humphrey had the vision of the Autism Treatment Network and sat on many boards, and if I had to describe him in one word, it was visionary. And then he said, when Bernie was in hospice, he asked to go home, and he went home, and he goes, I was with him, and he dictated his manifesto to me. Well, I got goosebumps all over my body, my eyes welled up, and I thought, what a better person on this planet to talk about where we've come from, where we are today, and let's think visionary where we need to go in the future. So please welcome Dave Humphrey.
Well, hi, it's really wonderful to be here. Can I start with a show of hands on how many of you are parents of a child? Okay, almost everybody. Bernie Rimland told me when I first started to be involved with autism full-time, this was about 12 years ago, and up until that time I was involved part-time. And he told me, he said, "David, you're never going to meet a parent of a child with autism that you don't like." That was quite an interesting statement coming from my background as an attorney, where you only liked about 15 people out of 100. Because you caused them a lot of misery, I guess. It's turned out to be true, that I've never met a parent with a child with autism that I haven't liked, loved many, because of the sacrifice that they make for another, a child, and the role that they play in their lives and they've played in my life. And it's such a privilege to be here. And I also have to tell you, when I was 10, 11, 12, 13, my dad was a traveling salesman, and he would take me on his road trips during the summer. And as we crossed the border into Canada, I would see him change. He would tell me that he now gets the call on buyers of lumber mills in Canada. And he would come back, he would leave me in the car, sometimes pretty hot, sometimes an hour and a half, and he'd come back and he'd always tell me stories about how wonderful, because for these people, they were his friends. He said, "Canadians, Dave, are a lot like Americans, but they're a lot better." See, he had grown up on a farm in North Dakota, and he was used to a handshake being his word. He was used to treating people like neighbors. He was used to telling the truth. And he said that's how Canadians were. So when I had a chance to talk to a group of parents of autistic kids in Canada, I jumped at the chance. This is my best combination. So again, thanks very much. Okay, so what we're going to talk about here is we're going to talk about the history of autism and the future of autism and what's happened in this modern era. Now, my principal job here is so that at the end of the hour or so that we're going to spend together, you'll have something tangible that you can take home and you can apply in your home and you can apply in your community. And you can say, I'm going to look back and I was helped by this presentation. That's my real purpose. It's not to give you a history lesson, because you can get that by reading a book. I want to show you how this ties in to where we were and where we've been. I sort of thought in our own country, during the problem that we had with 9/11, before President Bush went into Iraq, if he just would have studied a little bit of history before we started bombing that country, or at least even seen the movie Lawrence of Arabia, we probably would have had a different outcome. I think history means something. Okay, so I'm going to go with next here, and I'm going to have to get a quick lesson on how to do this. I'm a fast learner, so once I see this, I'll get it.
You're going to go. You should go, and then you just go.
Okay,
Right or
okay,
left?
right or left, okay.
Yep.
All right. Now, if she has to come up again, you'll think there's something wrong with me. Okay, so we're going to talk about three separate sections here today. One is the history, which is really the history of three principal people. It's Leo Kanner, Hans Asperger, and Bruno Bettelheim. The modern era starts with Dr. Rimland, and he would be considered the father of modern autism and a monster thought leader. Then I'm going to go ahead and talk about 10 other current modern thought leaders and what they brought to this. And then the top 10 stories and what I found can help parents and their children with autism. And I want to talk about the future. Now, this may seem a really difficult area, but I think we have to look into where we're going to go and what you can expect, because things aren't going to stay the same. We're going to have a massive debate between genetics and environmental causes that will lead to a decision in public policy throughout the world. Do we treat the next future generation of children with autism, or do we abort them in the womb? And that is the discussion taking place right now all around the world. The next is, can we prevent the condition? Can we prevent the condition? Okay. Let's talk about the history first. These three people, Leo Kanner, Hans Asperger, and Bruno Bettelheim. Okay, Leo Kanner, American, credited with the first one that used the word autism. And it was on a patient called Donald T. Donald T is on the your left-hand side of the screen. He was the first person diagnosed with autism. And then Leo Kanner found another 17. They all were sort of clustered in the same area. And interestingly enough, they all came from an exposure to environmental toxin on a fungus. So it all came, right, Jim? All came from sort of the same classification area. It was an environmental exposure that many of them had. On the right-hand side is the real Donald T., which is Donald Gray, triplet. Somebody went up and found him and interviewed him, and is still a real person. He just died a couple of years ago. So, but why did Kanner never mention Hans Asperger? Because Hans Asperger actually used the word autism about 9 years before. So it actually wasn't Leo Kanner who was the first one as popularly thought of. Well, first of all, Asperger had a reputation of being a Nazi. He was in Austria. And Kanner didn't really want to go ahead and get involved with all of that and credit a known Nazi. It was a mistaken belief, but that was still his feeling. It may have been a little bit of a professional jealousy. Always nice to name the first thing, right? So there are some strengths and weaknesses of Kanner's original paper. One of the strengths was that it was a unique syndrome, which he was right on. The second was that it had social and linguistic deficits, which he was right on. The sameness and the savant skills, he all got right, but he got a few things wrong. He did not recognize the cognitive impairments, only the affected ones. He also talked about this refrigerated mother theory, which again was totally wrong and proved to be wrong. And he didn't consider even the possibility of an organic cause on this until 1971. So there was also a continuing confusion in Kanner's mind. This is somehow schizophrenia, even though he went back and forth and back and forth. But look, give him a pass on this because it was really, he was by himself really pretty much on this. So now we go to Hans Asperger. And this is actually a pretty fascinating history. This guy was during the beginning parts of the occupation of Austria. And he was working in the field since his early 30s, and he used the word autistic psychopathy as early as 1934, and we know he did that because he published it. And this was 9 years earlier than Leo Kanner's papers, so there's no question about the fact that who used the term, who discovered the condition. But here's the interesting part of it, that as he was studying these children, the Nazis came twice to arrest him. And he was saved. And it was protected by his Franz Hamburger, not because of the name, I'm assuming, but just because he was influential with the Nazis. And his daughter, Maria Asperger's-Felder, agreed that Hans Asperger's probably had signs and symptoms of Asperger's disease. So how did he fool the Nazis on this thing? Well, how he fooled the Nazis was he called these children that had psychological abnormalities maybe potentially the future of the new German state. These actually were unusually bright people, and if he could work with them just a little bit, he could make them into what he called little professors, because they were so incredibly bright. He did not refer to genetic problems, because what happened to kids with genetic problems during the Nazi era? Yeah, death, right. Okay, and his paper was Das Psychic Abnormal Kind, the psychologic autistic children. I'm hoping there's no German speakers here because I think you'll all pretty well accept that. Okay, but Asperger was profoundly devoted to these children in his charge. He loved the children, he spent a lot of time, he was very kind and considerate. He deliberately used Nazi-style vocabulary, however, when he described these children. That's why we're thrown off. Because, you know, we see how he described the children, but he was going to make sure they're going to be protected. He did not go into some of the things that he probably would have if it wasn't for the fact. I mean, for God's sake, he had the Nazis come twice to arrest him. That's just not a mild thing. You know, you're not arrested and released by the Nazis. So again, he was playing with fire here, and what he said about these children could have resulted in their death. Okay, now we have the famous guy you probably have all heard about, Bruno Bettelheim. Okay, I heard about him from Bernie about every 20th conversation. Old Bruno would come up because he knew the guy, and he would talk about Bruno actually having this place in Chicago where they would take the children away from the refrigerator mothers, and there'd be a maternal statue in marble in the center of his court, and the kids would be taught to pee on the statue of mom. Well, I mean, this is pretty clear the blame, right? The other thing, they'd make clay models of mothers and poke their pencils into it and stab over and over again to get their vengeance out. So Bruno actually had a point of view. Okay, so how did he come to this idea? Well, he definitely blamed the parents. Let's establish that first of all. There's no question about that. He wrote, "The precipitating factor in infantile autism is the parent's wish that this child should not exist." Let's just test it out here. We had a handload of parents go up. Any parent believe that about themselves? Okay. Have you ever known a parent that's believed? Okay. All right. That's what Bruno believed. And actually, that's what he told everybody. He was the most famous guy by far in autism. When I prepared for this talk, I went back to the archives and I looked at every video I could find. They had a lot of them, including me on the Dick Cavett show. Big clapping on the audience and talking about these unfortunate kids. And I'm sure there are a whole bunch of mothers sitting there with kids that have been taken away from them saying, well, what the heck, you know? And Dick Cavett said, oh, you're an amazing man. So he was the man at the time. And his book, Empty Fortress, received rave reviews from, among others, the New York Times. It became a bestseller. His reviews known throughout the world, and still in parts of Spain and Argentina. It's still the going deal. It's still explained to people in Argentina. It's the mother. They take the kid away because Bruno Bettelheim still had that much influence. Why were his beliefs so popular? I mean, why would this make any sense at all? Okay, there's no evidence for it, none. Part of it is the strength of the Freudian influence at the time. Freud was sort of the guy, and he was a Freudian. So how do you go ahead and figure out a boy's problems? Well, you start talking about mom, okay? Continued resistance to accept genetic rather than emotional factors. I'll get to that in a second. And the notion that if something was caused by parents, now here's the big part. it could be undone. So are we all sort of hating Bruno right now? Okay, now let me soften this up just a little bit. Back before he became famous in Chicago, he spent 3 years at Dachau. He was arrested by the Germans and brought to one of the worst concentration camps. Should never have gotten out. He saw 3 years of the brutality of people coming in and being gassed and murdered, including children for genetic defects. He got out because it was Hitler's birthday and they decided to, at random, let 50 people out, including Bruno. So out Bruno came and beat a tail back to Chicago and became the world's most famous child psychologist on autism. Why do you think he had an aversion to calling these kids genetically defective? He also couldn't bring his fiancée with him because she ran off with another guy. And he also had a big fight with his mom. So. But he brought these children to his clinic because he wanted to prove that the damage done could be undone. These were not genetically affected children. These were children that somebody else was to blame and he was trying to protect the children. But because of the fact that he was dealing with something that wasn't real, as he was trying to help these children, some of them just didn't respond very well to him. So he would go from being the nicest guy in the world to the worst guy in the world. And he would use all kinds of disciplinary tactics that were just cruel and unusual, and then be the nicest guy for the longest guy. So, I mean, it was a really conflicted human being. So what finally resolved this? At the age of 70, he put a plastic bag over his head and suffocated himself. Bernie never told me that, by the way. It would have seemed like he would have. So, okay. So let's go to this modern era. Rimland, the early changes, the 10 thought leaders, and the 10 top stories. 10 top stories is going to be real interesting because after 25 years of being around this, I've seen a lot of things dealt. By the way, I can't believe how good Dr. Adams' talks were. I just sat here and amazed at how he took information that was very complicated, unpublished studies and some things, and hats off. Okay, so there's a couple of people that sort of softened up Bruno's problems on the Cabot Show and others, and one actually was a very courageous guy, Eric Chopra, who said, oh, phooey on Bruno, this doesn't make any sense. And he founded the program TEACH, which are teaching and education autistics on their communication, rejected the theory of refrigerated mothers, because with a refrigerated mother, right, they would always take the child away, every single time. And by the way, if she didn't agree that she had abused the child, they treated her for denial. What kind of insanity would that be? Okay, so Eric was a hero. I mean, he came out and took a lot of courage and really whapped over by all of his colleagues. And then comes onto the scene Bernie Rimland, who had a child. The child was typically autistic at birth. His wife, Gloria, didn't know what's up. And Bernie, even though he was a PhD in psychology, never heard the term autism. That's how rare it was. Probably one in, I don't know, 100,000 at the time. It was in the 1950s. And the doctor said very calmly, you have a child with autism, and by the way, we know what's wrong. Bernie said, as he told me often, oh, what? It's Gloria. Gloria's to blame. No, because when I come home, I see how hard Gloria works on Mark. But when you're gone and you're at work, that's when it happens. Bernie said, no, it doesn't. First time, no, it doesn't. There's something wrong with Mark. And in collaboration with Kanner, he wrote the book Infantile Autism. And he did such a persuasive job on showing that this was a condition of the child, it changed the world. He was a great man. And if it wasn't for Bernie, this nonsense would have continued a long, long time. As we see, things don't change often. Remember pictures of sickle cell anemia kids, skinny and prickly hair? Well, that wasn't the picture of sickle cell anemia. They all had gut disease. That went on in medicine for 45 years before somebody said, I wonder if they have gut disease. Okay, had nothing to do with sickle cell anemia, just comorbid. Okay, anyway, so Bernie was the father of modern autism. He founded the Autism Society of America. Jim and I both served on the national board, and it represented 150,000 parents. And it was set up so that parents had a voice and they had a chance to come together. It was a forerunner of a strong parent movement. Bernie knew that parents had to get together. He also designed ABA training. I bet a lot of you didn't know that. That Bernie designed applied behavioral analysis treatment, which has become the standard, and worked with Lovas in UCLA that got credit for it, but it was actually Bernie that established it. Also said autism was a medical condition. Oh my God, I thought he just said it was the child's neurological problem. No, he said it's a medical condition as well. And nobody believed that. No one believed that. Up until even 10 years ago, I was at government hearings where they all laughed at the notion there was anything medically wrong with these kids. It's just, oh, well, if they throw up and have projectile vomiting, it's behavior problems. Bernie said it's a whole body disease, and it was revolutionary in thought. He also talked about the connection with vaccines, and he got a lot of grief for that. Even today, I mean, it's widely discounted. It has anything to do with it. But Bernie would tell me, you know, I think I was wrong before. I think it was 1984. No, wait, I wasn't wrong then. So it's hard to talk him out of things. I always said I could make Bernie do anything he wanted to do. Okay, so he also started ARI and the Dan movement. He also sort of coined the idea that you can predict autism, you can prevent it, and you can recover from it. All revolutionary thoughts, now pretty widely accepted in the higher ends of government and academic researchers. Also, he talked about the danger of eugenics, and I'll get to that. He talked about the danger of know-nothing academics. I remember sitting in a group when we were talking about gastrointestinal disease, and I said, you know, the parents obviously know their kids have gastrointestinal disease. Well, how do you think, Mr. Humphrey, that they know they have gastrointestinal disease? I said, because they change their diapers and they see, you know, the diarrhea. She said, well, they're not capable of understanding diarrhea, whether that's diagnosed or not. I thought, we should really get 50 parents to send her in their diapers. Is this diarrhea, doctor? Okay. He also had a profound respect for parents. When I decided to do autism full-time, I got dressed up in a suit like this and went down and saw Bernie in Los Angeles, and I thought I was a pretty big deal for doing this full-time, and we're going to go out to lunch, and so I was there at noontime, and first time in his office, and he was on the telephone. It's fine. He was on the phone till 1:20. Well, that's an hour and 15 minutes or so. That's normally billable time if I'm an attorney. And he finally got done. I thought, well, that must have been a really important call, a big shot doctor or a conference call or something with a group of scientists. It was a parent. And I said, oh, how long have you known the parent? He said, oh, they just called. I learned something from that. That was a priority over meeting with me on time. And he was right. He was absolutely right. It's priorities. He made that a priority. At 10 o'clock at night, he'd go home after a hard day's work, and he'd listen to the news until 10:30. And then he'd walk back over to the office, because you see, he had a little cot in the back room, because you might be calling him. Lily, Susan, Jeff, you might be calling from Australia. He wanted to be there, and he'd stay there all night for those calls. Because he understood you. He just didn't know your name. He knew you. And he would take as much time as necessary to help you and your child. He taught me something. He taught us all something. He always talked about the dangers of doctors overcharging. He talked about the dangers of government. There were some people around Bernie that basically allowed Bernie to expand his thinking, be able to bounce ideas off of, and be able to make an enormous difference in carrying his message and expanding on his message. I'm proud to say Jim Adams was one of these guys, and Bernie often talked about his affection for Jim. Jim can look goofier at times, so I thought I'd put that picture. And that's with Jim and his daughter and his wife. And just a wonderful family, but can look pretty goofy at times. So anyway, Bernie relied on Jim a lot. John Pangborn, that's not the way he spells John. That's the way I spelled John today. It's Jon. This was done last night when I got it at midnight, putting John's name up there. So anyway, John Pangborn was a father. And I remember John lectured and was a PhD. He was also a father of a child with autism. The child was 40 years old in an institution. And I remember, and John was a close friend of mine, and John never talked about his son. And right before he retired from speaking, I said, John, why don't you talk about your son today? He says, I can't, because I failed him. I failed him. He's in an institution. I should talk about him and see what happens. Parents will think I'm a fraud. Talk about him and see what happens. And John started out by talking about him, and he cried. He talked about his attempts at trying to get his son perfect, and he couldn't. And he got a standing ovation because he was able to work for other kids' children, and he did his best for his own boy. And that was enough for the parents in the room. John was a wonderful guy. I think his IQ was off the charts. Sometimes he'd give lectures on amino acids, right? Right, Jim? People would have no idea what he said. No, no idea. You think Jim took a little mercy on you? John didn't. John didn't. When he described how wonderful the Krebs cycle was, that's all people got out of it. Steve Edelson was Bernie's #1 guy. That's Bernie's son, Mark Wimlin, autistic, the young child. Mark was as delightful a young man. He's one of the best artists I've ever seen. He's a savant. And he was the boy that Dustin Hoffman built the Rain Man around, because Dustin Hoffman was going to do a Jerry Lewis kind of a deal. And Bernie called him up and said, don't do that. That's going to set autism back 30 years. These are not idiots. They were called idiot savants at the time. So he said, come over and meet my son, Mark. So Dustin Hoffman agreed, sent Bernie over a picture of himself, and Bernie put it on the wall. And then Dustin Hoffman came over one day so he could start communicating with Mark. And Mark came up to him, and Dustin Hoffman knew he was a celebrity and knew it was a big deal, and everybody in the office was sort of getting pretty excited because it's Los Angeles, right? And then he turned to Mark and he said, hello, Mark, do you know who I am? He says, yes, I do. And Dustin said, well, who am I? He said, you were Dustin Hoffman. He said, that's right. How do you know? Because my dad has a picture of you on the wall when you were much younger. Dustin Hoffman understood something at the time. Sid Baker, monster doctor, a lot of early work, great guy. Okay, Lobos was the ABA head, and Doreen Grant-Pichet will be here. She was working beside him, and Doreen took his work and just expanded it. I don't know why I put down classical violinist, but sort of a cool thing, I don't know. UCLA, early methods, but he also had some problems. Electric shocks for kids, heavily criticized as he should have been. Claimed 49% of the kids were benefited or improved, and he was probably right on that. A lot of criticism. Doreen is a monster talent. She's got 1,100 people working for her. She's developed things that I've never seen before in terms of effectiveness. Margaret Bowman, she's head of the powerful Harvard Ladders program. She did a study in 1985 that for the first time talked about specific neurological abnormalities. Margaret is probably the best recognized autistic neurologist. The reason I put her with a child is she's very intimidating when you see her and talk to her. And if I ever mention how old she was, it'd be the last time she talked to me. She's very stylish and she's very, very bright. But this is the real Margaret holding a child. She runs a Ladders program that is the best program in the world. It combines medical and behavioral. So here are the 10 thought leaders, in addition to the ones that worked around Bernie. These are the ones that actually had a little more of their own orbit, but are no more important than the 4 I had mentioned on. So there's really 14, but I want to go and... one was Martha Herbert. You mentioned her name. Martha came on the scene from Harvard. This is sort of cool. She was an academic. She was a neurologist. She was a medical doctor. And she came out with guns a-blazing and said, this is a medical condition. This is a whole body disease. These kids are medically sick and they need help. And she said it over and over in everybody's face. And everybody got really mad at her and she kept on saying it. She says the same thing today. Took an incredible amount of courage to do that. She got shunned by a lot of people in her profession, and she was right. And she had the intellectual horsepower to publish, and we all owe a great debt of gratitude to Martha. Tim Bowie. Tim Bowie, I heard of somebody that had done 1,100 gastroendoscopies on kids, and he was from Harvard. So after my experience with Martha, I looked him up and we invited him to a conference. We couldn't believe anybody had done 1,100 gastro work on kids. And at the end of the conference, we decided I work in a foundation for autism. I think it's the best one on the planet. It's Northwest Autism Foundation, the Forum. And we decided to fund Bowie and his colleagues with a gastro project of $500,000 to demonstrate that kids have gastrointestinal problems, specifically and unique to autism. So Bowie and his guys at Harvard did that. We were successful with the project, and it set up all of the modern theories on gastro work. And Bowie, again, was one of these guys. He went straight from high school to medical school, skipped college, one of 100 kids in the country to do that. And he's an unbelievable guy. He's probably done 3,000 endoscopies by now. I'm going to put in Ken Humphrey, because he's my father. He's the one that started with Bernie 30 years ago. And it was when he took over a small company and he met Dr. Rimland. Dr. Rimland had a supplement. And I remember talking to Dad. I was in Hawaii at the time as a big shot attorney. And I said, well, Dad, why would you want to do that? You've got a very successful business with the fluoride. He said, there's something special about the guy. I said, there's nothing special about business. It's not enough to worry about. He said, no, Dave. He said, this doesn't have anything to do with business. I said, well, then why would you do it? Okay. My dad was a lot smarter than I was. He should have been giving this talk. The reason I've never talked about my dad is he's always insisted his role never be talked about. Because you see, when Bernie would go out and talk to a group like this in Kansas City, he would tell them, buy Supernuthera, call Kirkman. My dad would never let anybody answer the phone but himself. He would talk to every single parent. He never made any money over the 15 years because he gave a lot of product away. But he would call me every day and tell me the best call he had from a parent that day. And he would talk to me about children on the telephone that would talk to him after they began talking. He talked to me about the love affair he had developed for Dr. Rimland, and it became his life. And I thought he was nuts for a while. I thought, gosh, but you know, I love my dad, and something happened to him as a result of this. And he and my mother, again, he started letting my mother take the telephone calls, but he listened in for about a year or so, because he knew that for some of these parents, it really was this or an institution for their children. And he would come up and I would listen in as Dr. Rimland and my dad would talk for hours about changing one ingredient in Supernuthera to make it taste better. And again, that's where I got the phrase, you could make Bernie do anything that you wanted him to do, because my dad would never win those arguments. But he also ran the business in a different way. As the company grew, and I bought the company from him in the year 2000, and it was still a small company at the time. My dad had a policy that no parent ever got off the telephone without talking their situation through. If they couldn't afford to buy it, it would automatically be given to them free. And that our support was to have children do better. If we saw something else that could help them, it had nothing to do with us, just spend the time on the telephone. He supported Dr. Rimland not financially, but he supported him emotionally and would talk to him all the time. He supported doctors, supported parents. My dad died 3 years ago. He came into work every single day, came into work sick the last year. At the end of the day, he'd always ask me the same question. What's the best call you got from a parent today? And if I didn't have an answer, if I said I hadn't talked to a parent today, he said, what else did you do? I could never give him the right answer. So I'd take orders on the telephone, and I'd hear stories from you. It would make me understand how important it was that somebody understand what you're going through and be of maximum help. On the toughest cases, we'd give them to my dad. I'd have a telephone person come in. We're getting 1,000 calls a day at one time. Have a parent come in, call us, and I'd have the telephone person come in, and Amy would say, I just gave some products away, Dave, but you know, this lady in Atlanta, she's turned her electricity off the last 3 months because she can't afford anything. She can't afford anything. I'd say, go to Ken. He'd call her back. He'd turn the electricity on for 6 months, pay for her supplements for 6 months, and then say, tell no one about it. I'm telling you for the first time in my life about it, because I've respected that wish of my dad until now. He's been dead 3 years. We developed the line of nutraceuticals following every possible scientific lead we can, the probiotics, the enzymes, all the other things. And And we weren't the only ones that did it, but we're the ones that did it trying to do it right. And Kirkman still tries to do the same thing. I'm proud of what we've done. I'm proud of what my dad did. The last 3 years of his life, 3 hours of his life, we talked 5 minutes about his impending death, and for 3 hours about where autism was going to go. The same conversation I had with Bernie the last 3 hours of his life. These were great men. The next guy, Dan Rossignol, a medical doctor. He's extraordinary. And he researches, and he understands all the clinical trials. And he probably gets better results than almost any other doctor. I mean, extraordinary guy. And he runs a new organization called MAPS, which is the Medical Academy of Pediatrics for Special Needs. And it's an organization I helped start, and it is the best training for doctors in the world. We've established a 15-person faculty. It's all evidence-based. We're on our 3rd conference. We had 180 doctors in the last conference, and it went incredibly well. Most of these doctors had never treated a child with autism before. And we are getting an incredible amount of interest, and the protocols are very effective. I mentioned Doreen Grant-Piché. You'll hear it tomorrow. She has done incredible amounts for autism. Abir Adwad is a name nobody knows, but she single-handedly developed 5,000 child practice in the Middle East by herself. And it wasn't without a great deal of personal difficulty and attitudes of males against females in the Arab world. And Dr. Abir used to work at the Ministry of Health in Kuwait and ran a major hospital. And she is an incredible woman, and she's changed autism in the Middle East. Dr. Bowman I've talked about. She was also in my foundation. She was the head of ATN, which is the Autism Treatment Network, which I founded, and she sort of built a modern medical protocol with the other people of ATN. The government of the United States put in $70 million to build medical protocols. Most of you don't know that. It was recently adopted last month by the American Academy of Pediatrics. We're mainstream. Doctors in your area just don't know it. Part of the American Academy of Pediatrics, which should be a global standard, is these kids are medically sick. $70 million of the government research has established that. Margaret Bowman was key on that. Lisa Ackerman runs TACA, one of the most incredible parent I've ever met. One of the most, because I've met a lot of incredible parents. But Lisa has about 25 to 30,000 parents. They have gotten more kids well and recovered. It's an incredible organization. Honorable mention is Ruth Sullivan, the co-founder of ASA. Jeff Bradstreet, the first doctor to really put together a huge 3,000 kid practice and took all comers himself, a father of a child. David Berger, again, one of the best doctors on the planet, and he has a new program called P2Y, which I'll talk about. The 10 top stories. The dramatic changes in autism in the last 5 years. This is now we're going to a new section here. Okay, the first thing is the old thinking prior to 2006, which almost 99% of the experts agree to. Is that about a good figure, Jim? Okay. All right, and that is autism is strictly genetic. If it's genetic, it can't really have any issues, just like Fragile X, Down syndrome. There may be some comorbid medical issues, but basically it's a hardwired neurological condition, which treating isn't an option, really. It's just you got it. You got this condition. The new thinking after 2006 is autism is a whole body disease with a number of serious medical problems. That is a position established now by the United States government, the NIH, and the AAP, which just published 18 papers on it. It's over. It is a medical condition. It's well established. The proof is there. Doesn't mean everybody's treating these kids, because it takes about 6 or 7 years for that information to trickle down to pediatricians. But wait till some pediatricians do it in the community and some don't. I used to be a malpractice attorney. You sue people that are below the standard of care. The standard of care is the kids have medical conditions and need treatment. Once you have a significant number of doctors in the community do it, the others follow. That's how medicine works. 6 years from now, everybody will be treating autism as a medical condition. The other one is autism rates are not increasing. Boy, have they tried to hold on to that past 2006. Pretty tough with the CDC counting heads very carefully. Now, we know the worldwide rates are exploding. Autism is now 1 in 50 in the United States. Is it about that in Canada? Well, you don't have the same numbers. You don't have the same thing. Okay, it's probably 1 in 50. 17% increase a year. What does that mean? Well, since the 1 in 50 is 8-year-olds, because they don't diagnose them all until they're 8, let's extrapolate what a 17% increase means on the risk of having autism at birth now. It's 1 in 30. What will it be in 20 years? 1 in 8. That's where we're heading. No one thought it could be 1 in 50, by the way. It is. It's numbers. It's 17% a year. Just do a trajectory. The other one is autism can't be treated. Now we know it's treatable, and recovery is possible even after the development of autism. We're seeing a lot of kids completely off the spectrum. Let me give you an interesting example. I got a call from the CDC. We know a guy there. Jim and I know a guy there. We were on the board together. And he's in charge of the epidemiology, which means the counting of autistic kids. And he noted one thing that was really odd. 10 years ago when they started counting, when they had 1 in 250, only 1% of the parents said, oh, my child was autistic, but they're not now. That sort of means that the treatment worked, right? Just to some extent. You know what the figure was this time in the 1 in 50? By the way, they didn't count these kids. They decided not to count them. It was 25%. Isn't that impressive? Now, I asked the guy from the CDC, I said, did anybody bother to ask the next question? How? No. Why? They didn't want to know. They deliberately, by the way, skewed the studies so they get the southern part of the United States that has a lower rate of autism. Otherwise, they would have expected a higher rate, because in some of the northern cities, it's 1 in 35, 1 in 36. A recent, very, very good study out of South Korea is 1 in 33. Okay, so can the geneticists say that autism is not increasing? Yes, but it's a little like talking to a town drunk at a bar. It's pretty much a waste of time talking to them now, because it's obviously not true and they sound silly when you talk to them. And you might get hurt. Okay. Autism cannot be prevented. Autism is both preventable and can be predicted before regression and stopped, and that's what we're going to talk about later. Individuals with autism are disabled and will always be dependent. That's not true. Individuals with autism may not be neurotypical, but they can lead very, very productive lives. We have one study in Michigan showing of 600 teenagers with autism after going through training, 90% got pretty good jobs. And you're probably starting to see this in the news. High-tech industry is taking a close look. At Kirkman, we have a wonderful young man that does Excel spreadsheets for us on accounting. When he goes home, he does Excel spreadsheets. He has autism. Paul never makes a mistake. But we're also knowing that we can never change his monitor from the 17-inch he started with. That's going to be it. When I say, Paul, I'd like to change that monitor out for a nice new one, he is quiet, and I think he's not listening to me. And I say, Paul, is it okay if we change your monitor out to a brand new one? And he looks at me and he says, not going to happen. And everyone loves Paul. Every hour he gets and walks around the customer service area 5 times and sits down again. But it's showing that once people understand that not being neurotypical doesn't matter, once being listen to me now, not being neurotypical doesn't matter. Thank you, I had no other explanation than that. It doesn't matter. Okay, so what are the rates now? I mean, here's a good explanation of the rate. I mean, look at these numbers. I mean, this is where I started back in 1985, and that wasn't 1 in 2,500, it was probably 1 in 10,000. Nobody had the rates back then. This is a modern phenomenon. Okay, what's the third? So that's the second biggest story, by the way. First story is these changes in beliefs. The second biggest story is the numbers are increasing. That's changed everything. As you know, back 10 years ago, from some of your older timers, you didn't have anybody ask you about autism, right? Now everybody's asking about it. It's because of the numbers. It's because of the numbers. Okay, that's a big story. It's made changes. The third biggest story is we have serious gut problems and they're common. So I talked to you about ATN, which is the foundation that I started with others, Autism Treatment Network. It was done out of Mass General and Stanford and Columbia and Baylor, so they were the top institutions. The government poured $70 million into the foundation, and we actually did the count. Here's how we got the count of gastro problems. They took 1,600 individuals with autism that came walking in the door of these treatment centers, and they sat them down and took every other one, so it was completely random, and then got to the bottom of whether that person had a gastro disease or not from the age of 3 to the age of 43. And they found that 47% had gastro disease. Well, that's not an average number. That is not comorbid. That is a whole body disease. That means that every single individual with autism deserves to have their child screened for gastro disease. When you have 50% of people that are diagnosed with autism are diagnosed as having a condition, 50% having gastro disease, you must screen, Mr. Pediatrician. I used to be a malpractice attorney. You can't miss the diagnosis if it's staring you in the face. This is the position of the AAP in the United States. The American Academy of Pediatrics has picked up that same number because the head of ATN became the head of AAP, Jim Perrin from Mass General. So it's done. Okay, and here's the other thing they found. Parents, when they guessed on whether their child had gastro disease, were right 90% of the time. Why would that be a surprise to everybody? It was. Okay, they also found it's a unique form of gut disease. This is not celiac. This is not Crohn. Children with autism have a very unique form of gut disease that we're finding markers in the blood. They're very different. The markers in the blood may also predict gastro disease and may predict autism because the blood markers are showing up at the age of 6 months. Okay, also untreated can lead to serious disease. When I asked Tim Bowie, why did he get into scoping so many autistic kids? Because he scoped a girl with autism in her 20s, found gut disease that had turned into esophageal cancer, and she died. It had been there for 10 years. She had cried herself to sleep. She'd complained about it. Her parents knew about it. They couldn't get anybody to scope that child. She died of esophageal cancer at the age of 20 because of untreated gut disease. Serious stuff. Once treated, it makes a huge difference. Kids go to school. Kids learn better. I mean, you're not going to go ahead and do ABA training with gut disease any more than you're going to teach a kid singing lessons that has whooping cough. You can't teach ABA training when they're not sleeping at night or you're not sleeping at night. You've got to clear the medical issues before you do the behavioral issues. It greatly improves health and behavior. We went ahead and decided that we needed a pump in the arm with pediatrics so we can inform every pediatrician in the United States. So we got 26, our foundation got 26 of the best gastroenterologists on the planet together, including Bowie. And they came together, and for 2 years they worked on a collective 83-page insert in Pediatrics describing in great detail the nature of the disease, the agreement that all 26 of the best gastroenterologists in these major universities had on a consolidated paper, and published it without one word being changed in Pediatrics. It's one of the few inserts that had never been changed, not even a word. And that has gone on to create treatment in many, many clinics in the United States. What does it look like? You know what it looks like. Marked abdominal distension, food intolerance, developmental regression in autism. How can a doctor see a child like this with a distended stomach and think it's behavioral? I mean, to me, it's just incredible nonsense what has happened in this country. And you still get that in pockets. Parents report this seeing all the child bending over. It's because of the pressure on the abdomen. They've got stool all backed up. They've got stool all impacted and backed up. How easy is that to check? It's an x-ray. And when a child is treated for diarrhea, sometimes it's spirillous diarrhea. It's going around this impacted fecal material. Well, that's not a good idea to cause more constipation. So that's why these are medical conditions. Did all of you folks pay your good taxes to get free, consistent medical coverage? Okay. This is medical coverage. Many parents report this. I don't know if some of you are facing this. Many times that fecal matter becomes an obsession. Kids smear it around. It completely changes the dynamics. I don't know why I'm showing this to you. Some of you have this in your histories. But it does help to show this slide to doctors, to say, don't ignore these families when they come in. This is what they go back home to. Don't ignore these children. These children cannot live like this. This is an example of a hairball fecal matter with a child that eats dirt, eating dirt to get minerals and other things into his system many times. This is lymphoid hypoplasia. Poor Wakefield was rammed over the coals on everything, primarily because of the vaccines, but they escaped all the fine work he did on lymphoid hypoplasia, which is, he owns the literature on it. Okay, so how do you tell whether you have serious? These are the red flags. Now, why would the ATN develop red flags for the government with millions of dollars, not just this, but I mean a bunch of other things? Because we need a simple questionnaire to determine whether your child has autism with gastro disease. So if you answer any one of these boxes yes, you should bring the child in and the pediatric gastroenterologist should go ahead with further investigation, do an endoscopy. Let's read them because I think it's worthwhile. Number one, any apparent pain or discomfort. Resist eating although appears hungry. Apparent abnormal pain after meals. Discrete episodes of apparent abdominal pain occurring once a week. Nocturnal awakenings after appropriate interventions for a behaviorally based sleep disorder. Specifically, 3 or more loose or watery stools per day for more than 2 weeks, mucosis and blood in stools, 2 or fewer bowel movements per week that are hard and consistent, regular stains and underwear between bowel movements, flatulation, bloating occurring 2 or 3 times per week, unexplained weight loss, persistent or unexplained severe behavior problems after appropriate management. Okay, you saw all of those squares. Now let me see the hands of parents again. Okay. And for those that don't have these symptoms, keep your hands up, if you will. For those of you whose children don't have one or more of these symptoms, keep your hands, take your hands down. Okay, so most of you, right? Okay, how many of you have medical attention for those conditions? Okay, 1. Are you sure? Okay. So I was just told by a couple of parents here there's not a pediatric gastro person in Vancouver that will scope these children. How ridiculous is that? How ridiculous is that? Absolutely ridiculous. Saying we actually flew our pediatric gastro guy to scrub in with Bowie. We paid for it for 2 weeks so he could come back and start treating kids in Portland. He's treated 250, 92% of them had serious gastro disease. It's the first time anybody scoped in Oregon. It's just ridiculous. I shouldn't use ridiculous over and over again, but it is. I mean, in law, we deal with evidence. And when I hear doctors talk about, oh, it's anecdotal evidence from the parents. In law, we call this direct eyewitness testimony. We send people to the gas chamber on your anecdotal evidence. What are they talking about? So instead, you're going to have a paid expert come in, give better testimony? I don't think so. Okay, so what do you do if you have gut problems before you see a doctor? This is code for saying if you never see a doctor. Okay, probiotics. Jim mentioned a lot of them are done on milk. Kirkman's one of the few that doesn't have milk. I'm not trying to put a plug in for Kirkman, but it's the reason why we're conscientious in what we do. We make probiotics without any casein. It's casein-free. Okay, it restores gut balance. It kills bad bacteria. It helps food digest. It absorbs nutrition. It's gluten-free. 30 billion IUs are what you need. It has to be refrigerated. Most of the stuff in stores stored in hot warehouses, and the probiotics are dead on arrival. So you have to be careful where you get them. There are other good sources of probiotics, but not many. Enzymes, very effective in digesting all kinds of food. For many children, it becomes essential. Some children have actually normal poops by using enzymes at every meal. Vitamin D is very important. It should be 4,000 to 6,000 IUs per day, not 500, 4,000 to 6,000 IUs per day for every child. Multiple vitamins, that's really to correct poor food choices. And special diets to eliminate offending foods and toxins that aggravate gut disease. Don't underestimate that. These diets that Jim are talking about are incredibly important, incredibly important. The special carbohydrate diet he's talking about, it's because a lot of kids can't digest an enzyme. Bowie found that 38% of autistic kids have an isomaltase deficiency. They can't digest certain sugars, and if you give them those sugars, they're going to get sick. And it's going to keep aggravating the gut if you remove those foods. But how do you tell whether a child has a special carbohydrate problem with isomaltase deficiency? That's a long word. It's a hydrogen breath test available for $23 that no doctor in Vancouver probably has ever given an autistic child. 38% have this problem. Wouldn't that $38 be a really well-spent amount of money? This is what I'm talking about. This is why we created maps. The doctors could learn this information, get CME courses, and when they see you coming in, you know the information, they know the information, and it makes it really simple. Could you imagine going in with tuberculosis and somebody saying, I don't know what's going on, but looks like you got a disease called coughs a lot. Okay, sleep problems, the number 4 big story. 70% of the kids have sleep problems with autism. So I saw the hands earlier, so I want to ask you to put them up. And one of the ATN guys I was the lecturer on from Baylor said, I have the best clinical study in the world done on sleep studies. It's individual, which means parent-centered, one parent, one study. And by the way, the cost on it is 2 cents. Well, all these famous sleep doctors start paying attention. What's Dr. Draker talking about? He says, I print out a sheet of the sleep in the last 30 days on one side of the paper. And they fill it out for 30 days, and they come back and I take a look at it. And then I prescribe melatonin. And then I have them fill out the back of the sheet the next 3 days and bring it in. That's his 2 cent sleep study, and it works about 70% of the time. If it's not that, it's a gut problem, he said. And here's the red flag checklist. I won't go over it, but this is a checklist. Any one of these check boxes means your child has a sleep disorder. Most of you know when a child has a sleep disorder because you have a sleep disturbance. Okay, what to do for sleep? Melatonin is number 1. It's really well established. Jim mentioned the problem, the melatonin is short-lived. Make sure all the lights are out. And get time-release melatonin. Time-release melatonin can go up to 6 hours and 3 milligrams. Okay. Epsom salt baths, very good. Sulfation as well. Magnesium. There's some magnesiums a kid can drink, put in his drink, and it works. Strict diets. Diet causes a lot of sleep problems. The 5th biggest story is metabolic problems. Metabolic problems is where John Pang, where we start talking about amino acids and a whole bunch of things. Jim can come up here and talk for hours about metabolic problems, but I'm afraid that this slide is what we're going to do because it's a pretty complicated area. Metabolic problems are a big part of autism. That's why you can't get autism treatment in a box. It's complicated. You really need healthcare practitioners. You need to understand it yourself, and you need to have somebody understand it with you. Immune problems is the 6th best story. Majority of these kids have immune problems. Only 1 in 3 have immune problems. 1 out of 3 have immune problems in the womb, according to the New York Times, with autism. The problems are with brain inflammation. Martha Herbert and Margaret Bowman both have done extensive work in this at Harvard. Difficulty in communicating and repetition are signs of immune difficulties. Virus, toxins, and bacteria in the womb. So a lot of this immune problem is in the womb. Mother's history of autoimmune problems are a part of it. It's connected to gut disease, infection, allergies. One of the things we found, if we clear up the gut disease, sometimes we clear up a lot of the immune problems. So I've got 2 grandchildren with celiac disease, and it's not just not having gluten. The same insanity goes on in celiac world, by the way. When we took the kids in, we didn't know what was wrong with them. We went to 10 doctors. All of them would say, I know what he has. Remember when I made that joke about coughs a lot? Okay. As he was not eating, skinny as a bone, sick all the time, lowest 10% of his weight class, 3 years old, and scratched his mother's face when he got up in the morning. My daughter asked me what to do. I said, I'll come over and tell him a thing or two. Well, I couldn't even scratch my face. So, I mean, I knew there was something really wrong with him. We took him to doctor after doctor after doctor. His diagnosis was, Doctor, why is his gut so bad? Because he has irritable bowel disease. His gut is irritated. What does that mean? We took him to Thailand to one of the best hospitals in the world. They diagnosed him for celiac disease. So if you have celiac disease, it's pretty serious as a kid. How many kids are diagnosed with celiac disease? 1 in 1,000. How many have celiac disease in controlled studies? Anybody know? It's 1 in 100. The rest of them have irritable bowel syndrome and they're never treated for it, except with drugs. You ever see a doctor that has a pen on his table that says celiac disease? They have pens on the table for irritable bowel drugs. They don't have pens on their desk for celiac disease. There's not a drug to treat it. She still doesn't have a doctor in Portland that can treat celiac disease. It's not just gluten. He's got an autoimmune disease. Oh, by the way, the good news is we have self-treated. We have a great doctor in Portland that treats autistic kids. He's helped us. My 10-year-old grandson now, 7 years later, just won the state championship in gymnastics and is a 4-point student. And a couple of days ago, his brother, who is celiac, decided that when he won a math contest and got a few Oreo cookies and a piece of cake, he ate them in front of the class and immediately got sick as a dog for 3 days. So I called him on the telephone and I said, Tyler, how much is 2 plus 2? And he said, 4, Papa. I said, if I told you it's 5, does it make it true? I said, you have celiac disease. You're not going to change that fact. It's not your mom's rules. Okay, what does it look like? It looks like this. They don't heal very well. A lot of immune issues. bump their head, they don't feel it very much. Number 7 big story is ABA. And the ABA story is a card story. Doreen Grand-Pichet, who you're going to really enjoy coming in tomorrow, is a monster. She created a machine, and she created the studies and the evidence. She worked with Lovaas, and she demonstrated it has to be 30 hours, it has to be one-on-one, had to build that relationship. It's the application where all of these symptoms, actually this is her slide I got from her, okay. But it shows the difference between 25 hours or less was only 20% of the benefit, 26 hours or more gets to 61%. So, okay, everybody's looking at this and saying, yeah, Dave, 30 hours a week times $80 an hour times 52 weeks times 3 years. Why don't you write me that check and I'll do it? Okay, I know that's what you're thinking. And that's what Doreen was thinking too. So what did she do? She invested $10 million in a university to teach you how to do ABA training in 6 weeks. And for a few bucks a month, you can take that course and you have the courses to train your own child on ABA training. And I think she'll tell you tomorrow it's just as effective as having that person come in. Doesn't have to be you either. It can be your mom or your sister or your niece. This is within the reach of everybody. Why doesn't everybody know about it? I don't know. To me, it's an obvious thing. And I think government should do it free. They should provide that to you. But Doreen is going to talk. Why would she do this? Why would she do this? Anybody? I'm going to ask Jim because he knows her. Why would Doreen do something like cut her own throat with 1,100 people working for it, 80 bucks an hour, 30 hours a week? Why would you do something like that, Jim?
Still can't handle all the cases kids who need it.
Yeah, that's one thing. What's the other thing? I'll give my answer. She's a Rimlanite. She talked to Bernie once a week. She gets it. She gets it. She's not doing this for money. She's doing this because you need that help. You can't afford what she can do. Okay, the number 9 story is, here's the big one. Toxins are causing 60% of the autism in the womb. This is huge. This comes from Stanford about 3.5 years ago as they did studies with children that were twins. They figured out by doing blood spots, the toxicologist figured out what was going on in the womb, and it's these 10 chemicals. And these 10 chemicals overload in the womb are causing 65% or 60% of all of the autism. This is not a lot of speculation. This is a strong belief. I just spent the time with the guy, that guy talked about the CDC. I said, what would happen if mom had no problems during pregnancy, no toxins during pregnancy? How much autism would we see? And he said, I think we'd see none. This is not coming from some alternative medicine guy. It's coming from somebody in the CDC, United States, who's responsible for autism. How is that possible? We don't all know that. Well, what do you do about it? I mean, these are things that are in the foods: lead, mercury, polychlorinate, organophosphate. Here's a reason why they didn't know it before. For 20 years, they've been taking the toxicity loads of mothers and measuring them precisely, millions and millions of dollars. But then somebody had the bright idea, because they all thought we were being blocked in the womb, because the womb was a sterile place, because bacteria and viruses don't get into the womb very easily. So everybody thought, well, these toxins don't get into the womb, they don't get into the fetus. And then a little tiny group, this is where one person can make a difference, the Environmental Working Group, a little tiny environmental group, first class out of Washington, D.C., decided to test the mother and, when the baby was born, the core blood before any environmental exposures. You know what they found? They thought only 1% was getting through. You know what percent was getting through? It's 100. There was no defense genetically against these chemicals. The organophosphates and organochlorides, which destroy the neurological system of bugs and kill them. Bugs that are the size of mice were going to the fetus of 1-inch-old fetuses when their brain was starting to develop. What is the equivalency in cigarettes? It's about 88 cigarettes a day going to mother. So if you don't smoke, but you eat peaches and fruit and food from restaurants and from supermarkets. By the way, it's ridiculous in what's happening. We only inspect half the food in the United States. The other half comes from foreign countries. In Thailand, the shrimp are grown, not in fresh water, but in the sewage water. To keep them alive, they feed them antibiotics. They ship them. Only one shipment out of every 1,000 is inspected by our government. When it is inspected, they seize it, but they don't penalize the company. What are we thinking? What are we thinking? Okay, so big story, number 9. Toxicity ranges are high. Casein gluten, 10th story, leaky gut. So what's the future? We're developing very rapidly. That what's happening is there's an autism cluster of genes, probably about 161. Duke University is the first one to put a number on it. About 161 genes that show people are susceptible to autism in the womb. However, that susceptibility doesn't have to manifest. It is likely because environmental toxins in the womb are triggering it. How are they triggering it? The environmental toxins are affecting the frontal lobe area of the brain. So the middle cortex is being highly developed in autism. But when they're 2.5 and more functions have to be taken over by the frontal lobe area, the frontal lobe area can't handle it. It's been damaged in the womb by toxins. And this is going to be an emerging theory, which is going to get more and more credibility. And this whole notion of treat or abort. When Doreen did a study on high-risk 1-year-olds, and there was a study to show how you can recognize a 1-year-old about a 50% accuracy with micro gestures. When she did the study on taking those 1-year-olds at high risk and doing an intervention with ABA training, strengthening the middle cortex of the brain to compensate for the weakened frontal lobe area, of the 35 kids, none became autistic. But here's the trigger. And it's got me thinking ever since I heard the story. The average IQ was 130 of the children. Statistically, that's the top 2%. Okay, I want you just to think of that for a second. It's the top 2%. These kids had no signs of autism. How much IQ did it take to be a farmer? About 100. More IQ than it took before you learned to use tools, which is about 60 IQ. So there was an evolutionary jump of 40 points to become a farmer. In order to become mathematicians, doctors, mothers, salesmen, anything else, we need more IQ than the 100 IQ that most people have. Voters, congressmen, sorry. So there's an evolutionary change that may be taking place, and it may be happening rapidly, more rapidly than long noses or duckbills. Intelligence happens relatively quickly when the human species needs more points of intelligence. Is the autism gene an evolutionary gene? Are we looking at little professors? Are we looking at screwing up an evolutionary jump in intelligence? The dot connectors, the shipbuilders. You all know Temple Grandin? Okay. Temple Grandin, she's a friend of mine. I don't think she'd call me her friend because she's Asperger's, but I mean, she knows me. And she told me once, she said, you know, David, if it wasn't for people like me, adults with autism, she said, the rest of you would be sitting around the campfire yakety-yakking. So how do we know there is an abortion deal going on? Okay, let me take back some time. This is back maybe 10, 15 years ago when we were having a debate whether or not we should do genetic work on kids that have neurological difficulties. And Jim, what was that percentage you gave me? Was it 80% with what group? Okay. The 80% you thought was what group that had a neurological problem that were aborted? Huh? Okay, right. Down syndrome. I just forgot it. Down syndrome. I'm not the next generation of the little professors. Okay, Down syndrome. Down syndrome was a condition which they were able to diagnose in the womb. And once they became able to diagnose in the womb, it was done with the March of Dimes money. That was the research that got us there. It was done with parent money. Why was it done with parent money? Because parents wanted to be able to have a safer delivery of the baby, because a lot of kids with Down syndrome have heart conditions. What happened to the research once they found the genetic defect in the womb? Did anybody know? Doctors started to insist that the mothers abort the child. The lower the income, the more harassment the parents would get. To today, 94% of all people that get the diagnosis of a possible Down syndrome child will abort that fetus. So in the government numbers, there are people in the government that are looking at abortion as a solution. Why? It saves $3 million. It's a genetic problem. these kids aren't going to be anything anyway. That's why we have to win the battle of treatment. We have to win the battle of demonstrating that these children, I believe, are evolutionary children. They're the alphas of tomorrow. It is the way that we're going to progress as a human species. It is the way that God has given us to deal with the complexity coming up. We cannot decide to abort people that are not neurotypical any more than we can decide to make corn all the same with genetic variations to our food supply. There is a reason why we have the neural mix of people. There's a reason why genes evolve. If we can demonstrate that children can keep the genes, develop normally, and become outstanding people, we will avoid the eugenics. That's what I talked about, eugenics. Do we have precedent in this country? Yeah. The precedent was in the 1930s or 40s, there was a decision made that anybody that had a genetic defect, mentally ill, should be sterilized. Remember that? Okay. That was believed by 90% of the people. This is a good idea. There was a Supreme Court case, Oliver Wendell Holmes upheld a decision made by a state to go in and forcibly take a grandmother out of an institution that was beyond reproductive years and sterilize her, so it made sure she didn't have another baby, but with no example of any distress, and because that her daughter might have someone that ended in a mental institution, they sterilized the 24-year-old daughter. And then they sterilized the 3-year-old child. It was called the three-family law, and it was upheld by the Supreme Court. The California Eugenics Association presented a 10-page stage to get rid of genetic people that were not typical. The last stage was gas chambers. This is the California eugenics. One of the proponents of it was Henry Ford, whose picture did he have on his wall? Adolf Hitler, the only American mentioned in Mein Kampf. Adolf Hitler read the California eugenics study and incorporated that. The first thing he did is he killed all the elderly in Germany, 415,000, before the gassing, because these people didn't deserve to live. We have a Princeton ethics professor that says if a child is heading toward a genetic problem and not be a contribution, ethically he can be killed up until the age of 1. He teaches ethics, the head of ethics at Princeton, and kids debate this. We need to have this community be mindful of the fact the battle is not won because we have access to medical treatment. The future means we have to operate with one voice, forget these petty disagreements we have, and think globally, and think of the rights we have as human beings to be able to protect the future generation of children that are not neurotypical and respect the rights of those that are. And we can't go back and take a look at how we can say that's not going to happen, because that's a denial that got people in trouble over the generations. So our foundation has a high-risk project for 1-year-olds, which is exciting, because we can spot micro-gestures, we can treat these kids, and we think we can recover all of them. This is very exciting. The group is the Northwest Autism and the Forum, which I've been part of for 12 years. I'm not the only part of it. Again, very strong-minded people, and I'm just one of many. I'm on a sister board in Texas, and Jim and I are on that same board. We're all looking at the same issues together. We did the treatment guidelines, the prevention of 1-year-olds. Here is a new concept. I'll mention it quickly, then I'll end. It's an incredibly exciting program called Preconception to Infancy, or P2I. We worked on it for 2 years. It starts with the idea of a historical shift. In the last 50 years, we've gone from chronic conditions like tuberculosis, hepatitis A, and rheumatic fever to take a look at the rise in autoimmune disorders. This is where it's all happening now. It's all happening with children that have very complex disorders. The other disorders are growing quickly. But let's take a look at the numbers. This is the United States, and these are absolutely shocking. So what is the risk of an unsafe pregnancy and unhealthy baby? Okay, before birth, the chances in the United States, I'm assuming the figures in Canada are the same, of a miscarriage is now 31%. It was 5%. It's now 31%, which means almost 1 pregnancy out of 3 ends with a miscarriage. My son had a miscarriage with his family. They thought they were struck by God. They were 1 in 3. Half of them people don't know about. Half of them they do. Preterm is 12%. Well, is preterm a big deal? Well, yeah, it costs $65,000 in medical fees. It loses 10 points in IQ. And the baby that's preterm has a twice as high chance of dying as an adult as not preterm. They also have twice as high likely of delivering a preterm baby, their baby. It's a big consequence, 12%. What about afterbirth? Autism, asthma, allergic eczema, serious food allergy, celiac disease, ADE, dyspraxia, which is spastic type behavior, is 1 in 10. Bipolar disorders and childhood obesity. Do you know in these school shootings, we just had one in Reno, that out of the 270 shootings, 260 were by kids who were either just on psychotropic drugs or just off psychotropic drugs? And all this nonsense in the media about saying, hey, we need to provide these people mental illness care. Well, they got mental illness care. They got psychotropic drugs. So what is the percentages? Here it is. The odds from conception until 5 years, 31% will have a miscarriage, 12% preterm, and 40% of the population will have a chronic medical condition by the age of 5. Used to be about 6%. It's 40% now. So I'm putting this in context. This is not just autism. This is everything. We are basically poisoning a generation of children, and we are bringing them to a home where we freshly paint the walls with vapor paint. We put on new carpeting. If you cut out a new piece of carpeting and put on the bottle of a blank aquarium, put 2 white mice in the aquarium, they'll both be dead in the morning. Babies crawl on that carpeting. How do we prepare the mattresses? We spray with arsenic before it leaves the factory. Okay, are we nuts? So what are the chances of a safe baby? It's 17%. You're not alone. The body burden test I talked about created such a stir within the CDC. They went to pediatrics and they had an entire issue about 99% of mothers' fetuses are so polluted it affects the child. April 15th of last year. But you know they didn't spend 1 penny on publicizing. You didn't hear it on the evening news. Because this was sent to doctors saying, we must call for government action. How silly. They didn't call for pediatricians to counsel pregnant women that they had to cut down and eat organic foods and protect their homes and not have mattresses that were sprayed with arsenic and put barriers on, or not sleep on mattresses with antimony flour retardant because it gets into the mother's milk. If mother's milk were a commercial product, it couldn't be sold because it's unsafe in 98% of the cases. This shows the development of the fetus. So we found a doctor 3 years ago. This is the same thought leader I had, David Berger. I was having dinner with him and his staff of nurses, and he said, well, you know, David, we've had 500 children, because I'm a pediatrician and a pediatric doctor. I've had 500 children born in my practice. I've had no miscarriages, no preterm, and I've had no childhood illnesses. And I thought, David must be drinking. I know David really well. He's one of my favorite guys. And I looked at his 2 nurses and I said, how long have you guys been with him? Oh, 5 years, 7 years. Have you ever seen any example? No, we have a really boring practice. We don't have any kids that are sick. Are these high-risk couples? Yeah, a lot of them are high-risk couples. What is David doing? And that took the next 2 hours. And for the last 3 years, I've been working on David's protocol. I found 5 other doctors with similar protocols. They don't have any preterm births problems, no miscarriage problems. They don't have any childhood diseases in their practice. David's had 1 kid with eczema, and he thinks he understands why. So let's see, is there any historical basis for this? Yeah, Bernie Rimland 10 years ago said, I want you to go to England and check out the study done by Foresight, because they went ahead and did a retrospective study after the fact of 367 couples from very high-risk programs. And miscarriages should have been, in England, 25%. You see that number on that first square? But in this group, it was 38% because they had trouble. Stillbirths were 1% as an average in the UK, but this group had 3%. Low birth weight was 9% in the general public. They had 15%. And malformations, 3%, they had 2%. So generally, this was not a good group to study. First of all, they had a hard time getting pregnant again. So the 367 couples, after taking the equivalent of Dr. Berger's formula, by the way, it also means only breastfeeding for 1.5 years or 1 year after the birth, no toxicity in the home, no Lysol, no bleach in the home, by the way. You know bleach is processed the last stage in mercury, So you run bleach in your laundry room, you got mercury fumes all over your house. So I don't know why they do that. This is from Dr. Peshaw of the Mind Institute, who does not let his wife use bleach after his laboratory confirmed that. Mercury vapors in the laundry room while you're pregnant. Does that make any sense? Okay, so anyway, getting back to this. My wife tells me, stay on point, stay on point, stay on point. Okay. She's very tolerant, by the way. Okay, so let's take a look at the outcome of that study. After putting these women through preconception, which means 3 months before pregnancy, because you can't start this stuff after you get pregnant because the baby's brain starts forming at 8 weeks, and by that time, a lot of these nutritional entries and toxicities are still there, so you got to start preterm. Say, so preconception, let's see what they had. I mean, if we get half of these numbers, it'd be really pretty good, wouldn't it? Okay, I'm used to surprising you, so you're not going to be surprised. Look at that. Miscarriages, none. Stillbirths, none. Low birth weight, 1 kid, 1 ounce low. Malformations, none. And none of these kids had childhood conditions. Have I just opened your eyes up to something? Isn't this absolutely amazing? And why wasn't this study heralded as the best thing ever done? Does anybody know? Because the scientific community didn't do it, and they said there was no double-blind placebo going on. What nonsense. That's why juries aren't composed of professionals. The joke is you put 11 attorneys on the jury. It is an experiment on how good justice can be. Judge calls him back after 3 days, and he says, how far along are you? And the foreman says, the guy says, we're on our 3rd nominating speech for foreman. So that's why you don't want to have experts. You want to have common sense people. So this is absolutely incredible. Since then, they've done 1,500 couples, and not quite as good because they weren't as tightly controlled, but just about 1% miscarriages, 1% prenatal, and very, very few kids. So they didn't know why. We know why now. Now that we have the science behind it, what we're doing is we have a program called P2I. In Nevada, the largest employers in the state, in the northern part, 80,000 employees, have agreed to do a study done with 500 women. Jim and I are part of that organizing group in the foundation. And what they're going to do is put these 500 women through exactly what these Foresight women did. David Berger is part of the design of the study as well. It'll be a IRB study, and we're expecting we're going to get at least a 50% drop in all categories. When I talk to the CDC guy, he says, I think you're going to get a 70% drop because we're going to get some people not complying. And we'll have the published protocol. Now, why am I putting this picture up? What in the heck does this mean? It means that when we start the study, you won't have to hear about it from me a year from now. I'm going to be putting this thing on the internet. This is going to be a marvelous 3-dimensional site, similar to Second Life, where you can buy your friend an engagement ring. You'll be able to go into conferences like this. You'll be listening to all the CME courses. You'll see the protocols. You'll see how it's done. You'll be able to talk to other parents. We're going to be doing this with a democratization of a study that all of us get to see at the same time. And we'll be able to tell our friends, this is the way to have a baby, a safe baby. And we don't have to wait till the numbers to be done because it's common sense. We need to have the details. We need to have the playbook. So what's the playbook? These are, by the way, just scenes out of the campus. You can go to a parent forum. You can take the CME courses. Go to the doctor building. The doctors have taken CME courses and see those doctors. It is going to be an unbelievable site designed by some of the world's best professionals, and they're going to be doing it for free because they know the importance of global health. The workbook you'll get will be a day-to-day workbook. I'll be done here in just a second. A day-to-day workbook where you're going to be able to put your personal information in and get consulting services from coaches and people that can help you. Scientists will be running the project. Doctors will be running the project. There'll also be an exhibit room where people that sell commercial products will be in there. But the commercial products will be things like covers for your mattresses that are toxic-free, and we'll be monitoring all of those things. Baby bottles that don't have plastic goop coming from them when the baby drinks it. And publications from doctors that have things to say. These are going to be responsible commercial products. The last slide is one that haunts me because I travel globally. I've gone to a number of countries. I went to North Korea with my wife to take a look at autistic conditions in North Korea. One of the few Americans led into North Korea. And what we're finding is a tragedy around the world with autism. There's a little autistic girl. She's 13 years old. Since the age of 2, she's been tied up in that crib. You can see her arms tied for 23 hours a day. Her bones are shriveled because she doesn't get out of the crib. For every 70 kids, they have one attendant, and most of them are in their own fecal matter. You cannot go into a facility like this and see 3,000 kids tied up in cribs with a stench of fecal matter and the lights out and walk by them and see their hands move toward you and not be changed. We are overwhelming the world with children which have conditions that are not being addressed and not being helped. You wouldn't keep dogs in this condition. We all have gone insane with directing resources towards spiteful wars and silly spending and medical studies that mean nothing. And we are not doing treatment-guided research, but research behind treatment that can make a difference. Let's turn these centers into centers of excellence for these countries where people can be hired to take care of the kids, recover them, help pregnant women, have medical policies that make sense. Bernie Rimland knew how to do that. He didn't trust in doctors. He didn't trust in politicians. He trusted in parents like yourself. Parents that talk with one voice. Parents that make demands on what they need. Parents that demand medical treatment, psychological treatment, and funding for these conditions. And thank God we have the organizers here in Canada, and we want to join hands globally. This has nothing to do with political boundaries. This has nothing to do with political boundaries. This is insensitivity globally to a condition when people are not neurotypical. I want to thank everybody here. It's been a privilege to be here. Thank you.